Supermarket beef passes through 11 pairs of hands before it reaches your plate. Farm, auction, haulier, abattoir, processor, packer, depot, lorry, store, fridge, trolley. That's the industry standard. But Jeremy Clarkson's beef goes through 3: field, butcher, plate, slower, smaller. Considerably less efficient by any textbook measure, and yet worth £6 million, with customers queuing hours for it, which is not, by any conventional measure, how this is supposed to work. Here's how he built the one thing the entire industry missed. When Clarkson first walked into a livestock auction to buy beef cattle for the farm, he did precisely what he does best, and what has arguably underwritten his entire second career. He turned up with enormous confidence, essentially no relevant experience whatsoever, and a checkbook that made every farmer in that cold, straw-scented auction room considerably more attentive than they might otherwise have been on an ordinary Tuesday morning. There is a particular strain of English comedy in watching a man who has driven some of the fastest and most expensive cars ever built stand in a livestock ring, squinting at an animal, trying to work out with real seriousness which end he's actually meant to be inspecting, and whether the price being shouted at him is generous or an act of open larceny. But look past the comedy for just a moment, because underneath it sits a genuinely serious point about how the British beef industry has quietly operated for decades, largely unexamined by the people who eat its produce. The conventional wisdom in farming has always been brutally straightforward and brutally unforgiving. You raise beef cattle for the better part of 2 years, through mud, through frost, through the general and relentless indignity of a Cotswold winter that seems personally determined to test every fence post, every gate hinge, and every ounce of patience you own. Then you sell those cattle at auction, at whatever price the market happens to be offering that particular week, a price entirely outside your control, set by forces you'll never meet, in rooms you'll never enter. A middleman buys the animals, another middleman finishes them. A processor takes a cut for slaughter and butchery, a distributor takes another cut for logistics and cold storage, and a supermarket, sitting right at the very end of that long, increasingly anonymous chain, takes considerably the largest cut of all, while the farmer, who did every single hour of the actual work, the early mornings and the difficult carvings, and the sleepless nights during lambing season that has nothing whatsoever to do with lambs, is left holding whatever happens to remain once everyone else has been paid first. It is a system built entirely around distance. Distance from the animal itself. Distance from the farmer who spent 2 years raising it. Distance from any real, felt sense of where the thing on your plate actually came from, or what it genuinely cost someone else, in labour and worry and risk, to produce it. And distance, as any honest economist will tell you over a drink, rather than in a boardroom presentation, is precisely where margin quietly, invisibly disappears, extracted almost silently by every party standing between the field and the fridge. Clarkson did not set out, in any grand strategic sense, to dismantle that system. He set out, in the first instance, simply to buy some cattle for a pub he was attempting to open with considerably more enthusiasm than planning, but in doing so, almost entirely by accident, as does rather seem to be the running theme of his entire farming career. He built something the supermarket industry has spent 30 years and untold advertising budgets trying to manufacture artificially, and has largely, quietly failed at. Genuine, traceable, farm-to-fork British beef, with a face and a name and a postcode attached to every single cut that leaves the building. The farmer's dog was never supposed to be complicated. A proper country pub, doing precisely what a country pub has always been meant to do, serving food from nearby fields to people from nearby villages without unnecessary fuss, unnecessary food miles, or unnecessary corporate polish. Clarkson's actual ambition, when you strip away the surrounding television drama and the head-butting goats and the collapsing drains, was almost quaint in its simplicity. Every single ingredient on the menu sourced from within a defined and deliberately tight radius of the front door, close enough in principle that you could walk to most of the suppliers before your pint had properly gone flat. It should, in theory, have been the easiest promise in the world to keep. In practice, it turned out to be one of the hardest projects he has ever attempted, considerably harder, by his own repeated and rather weary account, than any farming disaster that preceded it, and there have been a great many of those to compare it against. Running a pub on a strict local sourcing principle means the menu changes with the seasons and the weather. Not with a marketing calendar drawn up 18 months in advance, in an office somewhere far away. It means the kitchen cannot simply telephone a national supplier and order whatever happens to be cheapest that week from wherever it happens to be cheapest that week. It means that when the beef supply runs short, because a local herd is smaller than the pub currently needs, or the weather has delayed the finishing of the cattle, or a neighbouring farmer has simply had a genuinely difficult year, there is no beef on the menu that night, full stop, and no amount of visible customer disappointment changes that fact one bit. Clarkson has said, with the particular exasperation of a man discovering basic supply and demand economics for the first time in his 60s, that farm to fork is a phrase considerably easier to print elegantly on a laminated menu than it is to actually reliably deliver from a working kitchen on a busy Saturday night. But here is what he built, almost entirely despite himself, in the middle of nearly ruining his own opening night, with a block drain and a failed generator. A pub that serves beef from cattle raised within sight of the building, finished on Diddley Squat's own grass and grain, butchered locally by people whose names the kitchen staff genuinely know and occasionally argue with, and served to a customer who can, if they fancy the walk afterwards, stroll outside and see the very field the animal grazed in only months before. No haulage between counties, no processing plant 3 regions away, invisible, unaccountable, and entirely unconcerned with your curiosity. No mystery whatsoever between the plate in front of you and its actual origin. That is not merely a supply chain, that is a working, breathing proof of concept, served nightly with chips, and it is one that every supermarket in Britain claims, loudly and repeatedly in glossy advertising, to be offering its customers as standard, and one that almost none of them, for reasons entirely structural rather than moral, can actually deliver. This is where the story becomes genuinely clever, and where Clarkson's instincts, usually, by his own cheerful and frequent admission, his single greatest professional weakness, became for once his single most valuable asset. Rather than simply buying cattle from whichever farmer happened to offer the keenest price that particular month, then moving on without a backward glance the way the commodity market has always encouraged, Clarkson built relationships. Tim and Katie Coles, cattle breeders who first sold him heifers and beef stock in the earlier, more chaotic years of the farm, didn't simply supply animals once and vanish back into the grey anonymity of the wider market. They became genuine working partners in the enterprise. They later rented him a bull. They gradually joined what became, in effect, a standing arrangement between neighbours. A small, entirely informal cooperative of local farms, each one supplying a different piece of the puzzle. Each one guaranteed a fair and reasonably consistent price rather than whatever the auction happened to be paying that particular Tuesday, in whatever mood the national market happened to be in that week. Think for a moment about what that quietly, almost accidentally solves. The single greatest structural problem in British farming for the past half-century has been price volatility. A farmer investing 2 full years of labour, feed, veterinary bills, and sheer nervous worry into raising a single beef animal, with absolutely no meaningful certainty whatsoever what it will actually fetch on the day it finally reaches market. Supermarkets have long insisted, with a certain amount of genuine justification, that this cannot realistically be fixed at scale, that the commodity markets are simply too vast, too global, and too interconnected to allow for guaranteed local pricing across 400 stores and several million customers a week. Clarkson, a man who 6 years ago genuinely, sincerely believed a combine harvester was primarily something you required a lengthy sit-down after operating, solved a version of that exact problem in his own back garden. Not through a government subsidy scheme buried in an application form nobody enjoys filling out. Not through a supermarket's carefully branded ethical sourcing initiative, complete with a tasteful leaflet and a small green logo in the corner of the packaging. Through a handshake, a shared pint at the bar, and a standing arrangement with the farm quite literally over the hedge. The beef the pub now serves has a name behind it, a face behind it, a farm you could reasonably walk to on a Sunday afternoon if the mood took you. That is not a supply chain innovation the supermarkets were somehow technically incapable of building. It is one they had simply, historically, never bothered to, because scale has always, for the better part of a century, been considerably more profitable than sincerity. Right up until the precise moment, an audience of several million people, watching every single week, started asking, quite loudly and quite publicly, where their dinner actually came from. Here, arguably, is the part that ought to genuinely worry a Tesco boardroom, assuming anyone there has been paying proper attention to a Wednesday night documentary about a farm in Oxfordshire. A national supermarket chain cannot, structurally, do what Clarkson has more or less stumbled into. Not because they lack the money for it. They have, needless to say, considerably more capital available to them than he ever will. They cannot do it because their entire business model depends on the precise opposite founding principle. Consistency across 400 stores, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. Identical cuts, identical weight, identical price, delivered reliably to schedule, entirely regardless of what any individual farm happened to produce in that particular week. That level of consistency requires centralized processing on an industrial scale, national distribution networks, refrigerated logistics running around the clock, and, critically, unavoidably, enormous distance between the animal and the customer, because that very distance is precisely what makes national-scale standardization possible in the first place. Clarkson's beef operation has almost none of that discipline, and that, rather wonderfully, is exactly its appeal. Some weeks there's plenty on offer, more than the pub quite knows what to do with. Some weeks it runs out entirely, and the pub simply says so, in chalk, on a specials board propped against the bar, in the sort of blunt and occasionally quite colourful language that would give a supermarket's legal and compliance department a genuinely difficult afternoon. Customers, remarkably, don't seem to mind in the slightest. If anything, the scarcity makes the whole enterprise feel considerably more honest, rather than less. A small, weekly, slightly inconvenient reminder that real farming does not run on a neat spreadsheet, and that a menu genuinely tied to the seasons will, now and then, unapologetically disappoint you, and that this is somehow part of the appeal rather than a failure of it. There's a term retail analysts use for exactly this phenomenon, usually in a report nobody outside the industry ever reads: the authenticity premium. It is the amount people will happily, willingly, pay for the genuine belief that what they are buying is real, rather than merely marketed as real. Supermarkets have spent millions of pounds over the years trying to manufacture that precise feeling, with hand-drawn packaging, rustic serif fonts, and phrases like locally sourced, printed proudly above a product that has, in point of fact, travelled 400 miles in a refrigerated lorry to reach the shelf it's sitting on. Clarkson achieved the genuine article almost entirely by accident, by being frankly too disorganised, too stubborn, and too new to the entire industry to ever build a proper industrial supply chain, and ending up instead with something considerably more valuable. The real thing, unpolished and occasionally out of stock. The local planning authorities, in their own entirely inadvertent way, have only reinforced this further. Restrictions limiting precisely what the farm shop and pub can source, and from how far away it may legally travel, were imposed by the council purely as a constraint, a way of keeping commercial activity modest and contained within an area of outstanding natural beauty that was never meant to host a tourist attraction. West Oxfordshire District Council almost certainly did not intend to hand Clarkson a marketing advantage, worth several £1,000,000, when they wrote those particular conditions into his planning permission, in a meeting room that presumably felt, at the time, entirely routine. But that, in effect, is precisely what happened. The limitation became the entire selling point, the very thing customers now queue 3 hours to experience. Now, if you're finding this as genuinely fascinating, as I certainly have, do hit subscribe and tap that notification bell, because there is a good deal more of Clarkson's peculiar, entirely accidental genius still to come, and you will want to be here for it. And if you've ever eaten at the farmer's dog yourself, or queued patiently at the farm shop for your own taste of it, do drop it in the comments below. We would love genuinely to know what you made of it. Let's talk, briefly and properly, about what all of this is now reportedly worth in hard financial terms. Taken together, the cattle themselves, the standing cooperative arrangement with neighbouring farms, the local butchery relationships built painstakingly over several difficult years, the pub that showcases it all nightly to a packed dining room, and the farm shop that quietly sells whatever the pub doesn't use that particular week. The beef enterprise sitting beneath Diddley Squat's rather better-known ventures is now estimated at somewhere in the region of £6 million. That is, admittedly, a modest figure by the standards of the brewery next door, or the farm's own considerable land value, but it is rather extraordinary for an operation that began, not so very long ago, with one enthusiastic, cheerfully clueless amateur standing in a cattle auction, entirely unable to reliably identify a breed by sight, let alone judge its quality. What makes that £6 million genuinely interesting isn't the raw figure itself, it's what it quietly represents underneath. A supply chain the size of a single village, competing in reputation, in customer loyalty, in sheer word-of-mouth goodwill passed between strangers in a car park, against supply chains the size of entire countries, backed by marketing budgets Clarkson could never hope to match. A handful of local farmers, one modest country pub, and a shed converted rather hastily into a shop, generating precisely the kind of deep, stubborn consumer trust that supermarket marketing departments spend 8-figure sums chasing every single year, and very, very rarely actually catching. Farming economists have long argued, in papers that mostly go unread, outside their own departments, and the occasional government consultation, that the genuine future of British beef lies in exactly this direction: smaller, fully traceable, locally guaranteed supply rather than endless, faceless commodity scale. Clarkson did not set out to prove that particular academic thesis. He set out quite simply to serve a decent Sunday roast in a pub with his own name above the door. But in doing so, entirely by accident and against a fairly spectacular and well-documented run of setbacks, blocked drains and furious councils, he built the working, functioning model that agricultural policy papers have spent the better part of a decade merely theorising about from a comfortable distance. Remember that spreadsheet from the very start of all this, humming away under fluorescent light. 11 stages, tracked meticulously, each one taking its own small cut, each one adding further distance between the field and your fork, and each one quietly adding a little more doubt about where your dinner genuinely came from and who, precisely, was paid fairly for producing it. Clarkson's beef travels 3, and it turns out that Gap, those 8 stages he never needed, never built, and honestly never even considered in the planning, was where an enormous amount of the supermarket industry's margin, and an even larger amount of its customers' trust, had been quietly leaking away the entire time, unnoticed for decades while nobody thought to check. He didn't beat the supermarkets with a cleverer strategy, or a sharper marketing team, or a boardroom full of consultants presenting slides. He beat them essentially by accident, by being too stubborn, too local, and frankly too disorganised to ever build the enormous, efficient, faceless machine that modern retail quietly depends upon to function at all. What he built instead was smaller, slower, occasionally out of stock on a busy Friday night, and precisely as a result of all that inefficiency, almost entirely irreplaceable in the minds of the people who eat there. That is the real story of the beef business at Diddley Squat. Not a clever strategy dreamed up over several long planning meetings in a boardroom. A man who bought some cows because his pub badly needed feeding, made a genuine, well-documented mess of it more than once, refused point-blank to fake the parts that were difficult or inconvenient, and in doing so built something the entire supermarket industry still, to this day, hasn't quite worked out how to properly copy. There's a line worth holding on to from all of this, one Clarkson himself has offered more than once, usually with a weary sort of honesty rather than any real pride. He said that farm to fork sounds absolutely wonderful, printed elegantly on a laminated menu, and behaves like an outright nightmare in a working kitchen at 7:30 on a Saturday. He's right about that. It is a nightmare. It is inefficient, genuinely unpredictable, occasionally results in a pub with no beef whatsoever on its busiest night of the week, and would make any professional supply chain manager wince audibly. But it is also, it turns out, exactly what a great many people have been quietly longing for without quite knowing how to put it into words. A plate of food with a genuine face behind it, a real farm behind it, a story behind it that isn't printed on the packaging purely as marketing, but is actually verifiably, sometimes rather boringly true. That, in the end, is Diddley Squat's real trick. Not the television fame that made it possible in the first place, not the brewery next door with its own remarkable numbers, not even the beef itself, strictly speaking. It's the quiet, persistent reminder that the shortest distance between a field and a fork was always there, sitting in plain sight the entire time, waiting to be used, and that the supermarkets simply spent the last 30 years building an enormous, extremely profitable industry around pretending it wasn't. If you've enjoyed this one, do hit subscribe and tap that notification bell. There is plenty more where this came from, and we genuinely hate for you to miss it. Do have a look too at the video on your screen right now, because we rather think you'll enjoy that one just as much. And drop us a comment below, letting us know honestly, would you queue for a beef so genuinely stubbornly honest that it occasionally runs out. Thank you, as ever, for watching.